We've all got quite a lot of downtime at the moment, with many of us being locked down, and this could actually be quite a useful time to utilize for experimenting with creative ideas that perhaps you don't have a chance to experiment with when you're in your normal day-to-day life. One of the things that I've been doing is I've been going through all of these archives of samples that I've made during sessions and never done anything with, and seeing what there is, if there's anything useful that I might want to cut up and use for stuff. And I've also been experimenting with this little technique that I've used on a couple of productions recently, which kind of breaks the rules of maintaining phase relationship between microphones on a kick drum. I can't say that I came up with this. I think I first heard it from Pete Miles at Middle Farm Studio, who has a technique involving taping two specific microphones together, putting them inside a kick drum, and flipping one out of phase and getting this really scooped kick sound that he likens to Metallica's Black Album. And this, I guess, is kind of my version of that. The idea is that it cancels a lot of the ugly mid-range that you might normally EQ away when you actually get to mixing anyway. So let's take a little look at this session. This is just a few samples that I've made of a Gretsch Brooklyn kick drum. It's a 24-inch by 14-inch. It's a really punchy sounding rock kick drum. And here it's mic'd with 3 close mics. I've got Shure Beta 91A on the inside. Now, if you're not familiar with what that is, it's this boundary condenser microphone that you literally just flop inside your kick drum on top of your pillow or whatever muffling you have inside. And it picks up a huge amount of the beta attack and also a lot of the low end. Being a condenser, it's got a very extended frequency response. It can sound a little bit too thin on its own or a little bit too slappy, so I'll typically pair it up with a dynamic mic of some sort at the port. And the dynamic I've chosen this time is a bit of an unusual choice. It's a Shure SM7B, which is far more well known as a vocal microphone for voiceovers or metal vocals. But a few people do use it on kick drum, and I've chosen it here specifically because it's got quite a flat mid-range, and you can also roll off the low end using a switch that it's got on the back of it. And the idea here is that when I flip it out of phase with the 91, it doesn't cancel all the low end because there isn't very much low end in that signal. And then finally we have a Stam SA47 FET mic. Now this is a kind of U47 FET style mic, but it can take more SPL. I really love how it sounds. And the purpose of miking up the outside head on a drum is typically to get a bit of the boom off that resonant head. And it's typical to use like a large diaphragm condenser because it tends to reproduce a lot of the low end coming off the drum too. So in this case, I'm probably going to use it more like a sub-kick microphone, and I'll show you how I do that in a second. So first things first, I'm just going to loop one of these hits and show you how it sounds with the mics just flat, with no processing going on. There's also a room microphone, but I'm just going to leave that out of this because it's not really the point of what we're doing here. So here we go. So it's a really great sounding kick drum. It's got a lot of punch, and it's very moldable, I'd say, from this stage into a really good kick drum that could work, you know, for rock stuff, all the way through to really metal stuff if you process it right. And what I'm going to do now is just show you the individual kick mics. So we'll start with the 91, then the SM7B, and then the outside mic, the SA47. Let's get into this phase flipping. So as I mentioned, I'm going to do this on the SM7B, and every time I click this little button here, the phase invert, it's going to switch between being correct polarity wise, and I'll just actually zoom in on these waveforms so that you can see they are all, you know, all the right polarity. You can see there's a slight time delay between the 91, the SM7B, and then a bigger delay over to the 47, which is outside the drum, but ostensibly they are all in phase. When I hit the phase invert button, it's going to flip this channel, the center one, out with the others. I'm actually going to mute the outside mic just so you can hear the difference as it's happening just on the two inside mics. So here we go. First uninverted, and then I'll flip it and you can see the difference. All right, so you can hear that's definitely a kind of out of phase sound. It's gone pretty hollow. But the interesting thing is the top and bottom end are left relatively untouched. Now, if we were just to pull down the volume of the SM7B a little bit, we'll get a little bit less of that phase cancellation, and that could be a good thing. Now, I know you're probably thinking the same thing as me, which is when you hear these two versions back to back, inverted and not inverted, you definitely can hear that something's out of phase when it's flipped and that the other way has a bit more of a solid punch to it. But there's something quite charming about that hollowness, and we've certainly lost a lot of the mid-range junk that was there before. It sounded like a good kick drum, but it sounded very raw before. And now it's starting to get, weirdly, a bit closer to a kind of polished kick sound. So there's one little step I want to make now, which is to mess with the timing of these two microphones. And I'm going to do this on the 91A. So I'm going to use just a sample delay, which is going to offset ever so slightly the Beta 91. Now, you could see that the two microphones were really quite close in terms of time alignment. So here, I'm not actually trying to align them as much as find a cool creative sound by adjusting that phase relationship through adjusting the timing. So check this out. Here it is on 0, and I'm just going to play with this. I kind of already know that around 30 samples is what sounded good when I was trying this before. But let me just show you what the difference is. I think it's probably best if you're doing this not to go beyond, I don't know, maybe like 50 samples, 60 samples. This is all at 44.1 kilohertz. So yeah, 50 samples at 44.1. Otherwise you start to get into kind of really weird phase territory, and you've probably gone further out than you have in. But let's check this out. Now, do you hear what's happened there? It's kind of cancelled that kind of really comb filtery mid-range spike that we were getting before, which was, for me, kind of one of the most obvious markers of the out of phaseness of it. It was that kind of phasey mid thing happening. And just by delaying that in mic by 30 samples, we've kind of ended up with a sound that now doesn't sound like it sounded before when everything was in phase, but it's got a really pleasingly scooped character to it. All right, so we're getting pretty close to a cool final sound. Now let's bring in that outside microphone. So I'm going to, first of all, show what it sounds like on its own, but then I'm going to show you what it sounds like with this extreme EQ that I'm going to apply, which basically cancels all the top end out. I'm low passing it 125 hertz, boosting 45 hertz by about 5 dB in order to basically turn it into something akin to a sub-kick microphone. So this is what it sounds like first. And we're going to combine that with the other two microphones. So I'm going to start with the fader at 0 actually, and then just gradually bring it up until it's adding some nice meat to the kick drum sound. Now I've got the feeling that we're getting a bit of phase cancellation going on here because of the kind of processing that we've done to the other mics that might be affecting that low end. So let's chuck on a sample delay and mess with the delay here until we get something that sounds like it's got loads of low end to it. I'm going to bring up the mic a little bit more so I can hear the phase relationship really clearly. So for me, that's sounding pretty cool. Again, this is all about kind of using the phase offset in a, using the time offset in a creative way. I don't really know how those waveforms would line up if you actually printed them through this time delay. It would probably look a bit weird, but just listening to it, the sound of that now is of a kick drum that's got a nice low end bloom to it. So I like that, some of those three microphones. I might just bring the outside mic down a little bit in volume again. What might we want to do with this? I personally would want to add a little bit of compression, and I'm going to use here the GGD Smash and Grab 2.0 plugin. And I've kind of just by ear tuned in some settings. So I've got an attack time of nearly 50 milliseconds, a release time 140, quite a high ratio of 6:1. I'm also using a bit of the air control set to 7 kilohertz to bring in a little bit of extra click on the drum. And I've pulled down the threshold to taste. There's also a tiny bit of saturation, just a really little bit to hopefully tame a little bit of transient there in tape mode and thicken up the sound somewhat. So I'll show what it sounds like without and then with. There you have it. That to me is a really cool sounding kick drum that we could use as a sample either in a very aggressive, heavy style of music, something like deathcore, something like that, where you've got like a need for a very impactful and attacky sounding kick. The other thing you could use this for is to supplement a natural kick to give it a consistent top and bottom end, because we've now got quite a kind of scooped out sounding kick drum without all that much mid-range information. When we blend that with a natural kick that has a bit more mid-range, you hear the fluctuation and the inconsistency in the mid-range based on the natural drum, but then you'll get the consistency of the even click and bottom end that this sample would add if you were to use it as a one-shot, or if I were just to select a small number of these kicks that have a similar character, just to give them a little bit more movement rather than one static one-shot sample. So I hope that this has been kind of an interesting tutorial for you. Maybe it will open the door to the idea that perhaps, as important as things being in phase is a lot of the time, sometimes you can get some creative results by messing with that phase relationship to generate an entirely new sound that you couldn't achieve any other way. Maybe it's not going to be a technique that you end up using because it's not appropriate for the style that you like or the sounds that you like. But if you want to hear an example of how I've used it, take a listen to the new Bleed From Within record, Structures. It's actually not out yet, but there is a single called Into Nothing, and you can hear the sound which I got there from Ali's natural kick drum, which I did this kind of processing to, combined with some supplemental samples from his kick drum as well, to make it ultra consistent for the mix. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it interesting. Stay safe wherever you are, and I'll make some more videos for you soon.